Hi, welcome to the Midtown Vineyard Podcast. We're so glad you've joined us online. For daily encouragement, events, service times, and more, check out our website and social media. And now, this week's message.
Amen. Good morning. I am all sweaty. I was down playing ping pong with some of our students a minute ago, and I told them they won. I'm pretty sure I won. And I don't know if you're anything like me. I'm curious how many of us have some sort of self-improvement app on our phone. And this can take a lot of different shapes. Like, this could be podcasts that you listen to, audiobooks, some kind of steps tracking or digital reading of like your own metrics, right? Calorie logging, like probably a bunch of us. You know what was crazy? I was reading recently an article about how much self-improvement stuff there is out there. And in this digital age, what the people who wrote this article were blown away by was that it just continues to go up. Like they were noticing that even during the pandemic, in the shutdown in the economy, when everything tanked, self-improvement digitally continued to go up. The global market was valued at a whopping $39 billion in 2019, and as of today, it's somewhere near 60, right? I mean, it just continues to climb despite pandemic. And the idea of self-improvement, this whole idea of I just want to make me a better me, I want to make a better version of me, you want to make a better version of you, out of you, and it's not a bad thing, right? I think we all know that that's a good thing. The problem with it, and if you're like me, it only lasts for a little while. Right? You've probably seen this before. You go to health clubs, those of you who visit gyms or have a gym membership and you work out year round, but you'll notice in January is like everybody's there. You're like, where do these people come from? But by February, you're like, those people are gone again, right? Because it's like that here at church too. You see people just kind of fill the room in January because we're all so committed. And then by February, it's just kind of, it gets away from us a little bit, right? And I don't think these are bad things. I think it's good. I think it's good to stop and examine and kind of take note, take track where you want to be, where you are, like what do you need to eat more of, what do you need to eat less of, right? Those are not bad things, right? But if we're not careful, the question we end up focusing on with most of our energy, especially because of the culture that we live in, is what should I do about me? What should I do about me? How do I make a better version of me? How do I become slimmer? How do I get smarter? How do I get where I want to be financially? And again, those aren't bad things, but what I want to focus our attention on this morning is a bigger, broader, better question. In fact, it's a question that you might find a little bit threatening. I've got to warn you about that up front. In fact, you might actually find it disturbing, and that's good. That's why I want to talk about it. And so to introduce the question, I'm going to do something I don't normally do. So if it's your first time this morning, know that we don't normally do this. Some Sundays we'll take like one verse, 2 verses, 3 verses, and we'll just focus on those the whole time. This morning, I'm going to read to you an entire chapter of the Bible. Some of you are going, this is the Sunday I came, like the Sunday he's going to read an entire. No, we're going to go through an entire chapter of the Bible. If you have your Bibles, you can open up to Nehemiah chapter 3. You might want to use your table of contents for it. It's a bit difficult to find. If you didn't bring a Bible, you can raise your hand and Jay will bring you one. And then 2, I'm going to also, and I don't normally do this either, but I'm going to also, just like we did last week, I'm going to put these verses on the screen because I really want to make sure that we see all that's going on. Nehemiah was this ancient Jewish person, while you turn there, who did an extraordinary thing. In fact, it was so extraordinary that his journal, called Nehemiah, the book of Nehemiah, his journal was added to the Old Testament by the Hebrew people later. It wasn't originally a part of it, right? It predates the Jewish Bible, but it was added to the Old Testament. And those of us who are believers today, who have a New Testament that got added to the Old Testament, that's how we inherited this book of Nehemiah. And the reason that they found it so special is because it's an extraordinary story about extraordinary leadership who did an extraordinary thing. And if you're not a Bible person, but you are just kind of focused in on that, like this is a great story for you. The story of Nehemiah is found in the Old Testament book of Nehemiah. Is a story about hard work and discipline and vision and all these good things that you can connect with, even if you're like, I don't know where I am with the whole Bible thing. Because that's the other important thing about Nehemiah's book, is that there's no miracles in it. right? There's nothing that, supernatural that happens. It's just about discipline and hard work. In fact, this ancient document is one that we could use just kind of across regions. And so this story takes place right after what we'll call the Jewish exile. You may remember this from last week. A little history lesson for you. In about 605 BC, the Babylonians invaded Judah. And if you think of like modern day Israel, there's a top half, bottom half, northern kingdom, southern kingdom in this age. Israel is the top, Judah's the bottom. And so they invaded Judah, the southern kingdom. And so for about 70 years, the nation of Israel just kind of shut down. Temple worship shut down. They kind of went out of business because they'd been conquered by the Babylonians. And about 70 years go by, and then the Persians march in and conquer the Babylonians. They kick them out. Now the Persians are in charge, and Cyrus the Great is in charge of the Persians. And he decides, as he looks around, he notices that there's Jews that have been kind of gathered from Jerusalem and brought to the capital there. He notices all these Jews, and he's like, why do we have so many Jews all over the place? And so he makes this big announcement. He's like, hey, if the Babylonians took you out of your homeland somewhere back in the day before we got here, everybody go home. Everybody's free to go home. So everybody was kind of able to migrate back to their nation of origin. Tens of thousands, eventually hundreds of thousands of Jews all migrating back to Israel. And they try to crank up the economy and get the temple going again and all that, but it doesn't go so well. Right? Because when the Babylonians came and invaded, they took the best and the brightest from Jerusalem back with them back to Babylon. And so they're having trouble getting things going again. The economy is stalled. Other people have moved into the region. Suddenly you got all these people coming into the same place in a city with no walls, as we said last week. So there's a lot of things going on. And about 90 years into this is where we meet Nehemiah. He's a Jewish man, Nehemiah is. We don't know if he's ever been to Israel. We don't know if he's ever seen Judah. We don't know if he's ever seen the city of Jerusalem. When we meet him, though, he works for who's now in charge of the Persian Empire, King Artaxerxes of Persia. And all we know about him is that he works for him, works for the king. He journals his story. We have it in our English Bibles called the book of Nehemiah. So I'm going to read this first chapter to you from this Old Testament book about Nehemiah, and then I'm going to ask you this disturbing question that I kind of told you was on its way. So that's where we're going this morning. Any questions? Okay, good. We're just going to launch in. I'm just going to read it up here on the screen. So the words of Nehemiah, this is how the story starts. Son of Hakaliah, in the month of Kislev, in the 20th year. So here's what's important kind of starting out. Notice how it starts. The words of Nehemiah. It doesn't start with once upon a time in a land far, far away. This is history that we're reading. This is somebody's journal, and that's significant. In the month of Kislev, in the 20th year, while I was in the citadel of Susa. Susa is essentially the capital city. They don't really have capital cities back then, but if you think of Susa as the capital city of the Persian Empire. Hanani, verse 2, one of my brothers came from Judah. Judah, remember, it's the southern part of the kingdom, with some other men, and I questioned them about the Jewish remnant that had survived the exile. Now remember, all these people are migrating back to their homeland. And so what Nehemiah is asking, his brother comes to visit, he's got a kind of entourage with him, and he goes, how are things going back in Jerusalem? He's heard about people that are migrating back. He has stayed, Nehemiah has. His brother went back but came to visit Nehemiah. And Nehemiah goes, how are things going back in Jerusalem? Back in the homeland with the ones who went there. And those who had survived the exile. Because remember, these families had been displaced. They had survived that. They'd had grandkids. Now they're back in Jerusalem when Cyrus said they were able to move back. So these guys come to see Nehemiah. They ask how it's going. And he's like, do you guys have the temple going? Is the city rebuilt? Do you have the wall going? Is it a nation again? I mean, how are things going? Verse 3, they said to me, those who survived the exile and are back in the province are in great trouble and disgrace. Nehemiah, it's not going so well. Things are really hard. Things are not going well. They're going so poorly. The wall of Jerusalem, we said this last week, the wall of Jerusalem is broken down and its gates have been burned with fire, which basically means we have no defense system. Like, we're a mockery. This is humiliating. And anybody can come in and take whatever they want, and they've been doing that. Whenever we accumulate anything, all these other invaders are kind of watching, and they just come in and take it, and we can't stop them. Things, Nehemiah, are not good. And then this next powerful statement in Nehemiah's journal, verse 4, when I heard these things, I sat down and wept. I mean, Nehemiah is broken over this. It's not just news, right? It's not just, oh, hey, that stinks, I hate to be you. Like, here's a check, God bless, good luck, because I live in Susa, I work for the king, I got it made in the shade. I live indoors, I know where every one of my meals is going to come from. I'm raising my family with the most powerful, wealthiest man in the whole world. Sorry about Jerusalem. See ya, wouldn't want to be ya. That's not his response. Right? When he finds out about what's going on, his heart is broken. It's that he weeps, and he weeps not just in a moment, he weeps for days, right? The next verse, for some days I mourned and fasted and prayed before the God of heaven. Then I said, and then he journals his prayer for us. This is extraordinary. He journals his prayer for us. Then I said, Lord, the God of heaven, the great and awesome God, I love this, who keeps his covenant. Now, Nehemiah is reminding God of what he said, right? Nehemiah is quoting God to God. Okay, God, you keep your promises, right? I'm going to remind you that you keep your promises. And he uses the word covenant because God established a covenant with Israel back in the day. You may remember. Now he's going to sort of say back to God what God originally said in that covenant to the nation all those years ago. He says, you keep your covenant of love with those who love you and keep your commandments. Because that was kind of the thing in the Old Testament. If you remember, God set up this sort of conditional relationship with Israel. It kind of went like this. Here's my laws. You keep my laws, you keep your land, right? You keep my laws, you keep your land. If you break my laws and abandon me, if you break my laws and embarrass me, then you're going to lose your land. I'm going to take it from you, and I'm going to send you to other nations around the world. That's just sort of how this covenant went. Nehemiah continues, let your ear be attentive and your eyes open to hear the prayer your servant is praying before you day and night for your servants, the people of Israel. And then he does something really interesting. He says, he goes on from here, I confess the sins that we Israelites, including myself and my father's family. Isn't that humble? Like, I'm not pointing fingers here. I'm not making excuses. We're all guilty, me included. I confess the sins we've committed against you. We have acted very wickedly towards you. Implication, we deserve to be kicked out. We deserve to be thrown out of town. We deserve to be thrown out of our land. We broke the agreement that you established with our forefathers long ago. We have not obeyed the commands, decrees, and laws that you gave your servant Moses. Because if you remember, this contract sort of started with Moses, right? Remember, verse 8, the instruction you gave your servant Moses, saying, so he reminds him that this is where this covenant comes from. Remember the contract you set up with Moses. And now he's going to remind him he's going to quote God to God. He's quoting God to God. If you are unfaithful, I will scatter you among the nations, which is exactly what had happened, right? That's exactly why they're in this situation. They'd been unfaithful, and so God allowed them to be scattered. And Nehemiah can see all of this with astounding clarity as he looks back. He's like, you said it would happen. We did it. It happened. You're right for scattering us. If you're unfaithful, I will scatter you among the nations. But, this is a big but if you return to me and obey my commands, now check this out, then even if your exiled people are at the farthest horizon, I will gather them from there and bring them to the place I have chosen as a dwelling place for my name. Because Israel was God's nation. The city of Jerusalem was precious. And there in the Holy of Holies in the temple, the people believed dwelled the very presence of God. And so Nehemiah is saying, God, you said if we return, you were right for kicking us out, right? We let down our side of the contract, but you said, if we will return to you, you will bring us home. You will make things the way that things were supposed to be. And this is interesting because I think this is a little bit different, right, than the propensity I think we all have to get ourselves in situations and then to kind of run from those situations and just spray a little Jesus juice on them, right? Like, oh, fix this. Like, God, get me out of this, right? That's lucky rabbit foot theology. That's voodoo Christianity. I can live however I want, and God, Jesus, you'll just fix this for me, right? That's not what he's saying. He's saying, you said, if we return to you, if we confess, if we repent, if we move the other way, if we declare, I'm lost, I need a way home, then what you said, God, is that you will return to us and we will be returned to you. What he's saying here, quoting God to God, is that part of the arrangement is we must return to you. We must repent. We must confess. We must turn around. That's not a spiritual ollie ollie oxen free. That's a spiritual 180. And then, God, you said you will gather us together again. Verse 10, they, talking about Israel, they are your servants and your people who you redeemed. And he's reminding them of how this all got started. He's like, you remember that whole Moses thing, right? The plagues and the guy, the Pharaoh, the Red Sea, all this stuff. You went to great lengths to redeem us the first time. And now we're not in Egypt anymore. We're scattered all over the place. And so, God, would you be willing to redeem us again? You went through great trouble to do. Would you be willing to do it again? Because you went through great trouble in the first place, and we need it again. By your great strength and your mighty hand, Lord, let your ear be attentive to the prayer of this your servant and to the prayer of your servants who delight in revering your name. And then he asks for something very specific, and I love this. He says, give your servant success. It's so awesome. Give your servant success today by granting him favor in the presence of this man. Now here's what he's about to do. Nehemiah, who's got it made, who's living in luxury, right? Literally made in the shade, great job, living the life, in the palace, everything he wants, everything he needs, in daily contact with the most powerful person in the world, on the planet. He's about to go into King Artaxerxes and go, King, I need an indefinite leave of absence. Like, I need to leave my cush job. I need to leave this incredible environment that you've created. I'd like to leave my family, and I'd like to go to Jerusalem, and like to help with the rebuild there and the reestablishment of my people in that land. Now, this is risk. You don't ask the king for favors. He's the king. He asks you for favors. You don't ask. He tells you. Right? It doesn't work the other way around. This is risky. And even if it works, this is an incredible sacrifice for Nehemiah. To leave his family, to go to a place we don't know that he's ever been before. We don't know that he's fallen in love with Jerusalem and wants to return. No, he just heard about something that was going on somewhere else. Likely he's never been there because he was raised in Susa, but his heart was broken. And it was so broken that he felt compelled to act on what he had just heard. And then I love the kind of dramatic way that this chapter just kind of ends, the mic drop at the end. I was cupbearer to the king. So, that disturbing question that I warned you about. Here's my question. What breaks your heart? What breaks your heart? When you look around the community, when you look around the world, when you look at the state of things in our country, or maybe the economy, the school system, when you look at what's happening with families, when you look at what's happening with children, just the whole state of things. I don't know what it is that captures your attention, but when you look around and you see the way things are, and it just breaks your heart. In fact, it so breaks your heart that you try not to think about it. Because every time you start thinking about it, you can't get it off your mind. You can't get it off your heart or your thoughts. But when you go there mentally, when you go there emotionally, it's so disturbing. And so disturbing that you try to not think about it. And you kind of write yourself off and go, well, things have always been that way. Things are always going to be that way. There's nothing that I can do about it. I'm a nobody. I don't have any resources. I'm too young. I'm too old. I'm too middle class, I'm too busy, I'm too disconnected, and I hope, God, would you please do something? Would you please send somebody over there? Because that's a big problem, and I can't even think about it because I get too emotional. So God, if you would take care of it, right? What is it that breaks your heart like that? That's a dangerous, dangerous question. And many of us, instead of thinking this way, we go into a different mode of thinking, right? We start asking, like, what can I do about me? What should I do about me? Right? That's the whole self-help thing, and we focus ourselves on it, and we distract ourselves with it instead of a better question that is, what should be done around me? What's going on in this world? Because here's the truth, and I think we all agree on this. If you want to become a better person, do something to make the world a better place. Right? Do something that makes the world a better place. There's this old Latin proverb that says, what is a man who does not leave the world or make the world better? Now here's something, I don't know you personally, but I know this about you because it's true for all of us. The people you admire most, the people you tell your kids about, the ones you read biographies about, or the ones they make movies about, people who have inspired us to greatness, people that we admire most. We're not people who did just these ordinary, self-centered things, right? The people who inspired you the most don't inspire you because they were able to maintain their ideal weight. Right? You don't go watch movies about folks who are like, you won't believe he got out of debt. And I'm not saying that any of those are bad things. I mean, those are good. They're important. Some of us need to get out of debt. Some of us need to eat more vegetables. I think some of us should lose weight, but that's not what inspires you. What inspires you, what inspires me, the people we're so grateful for, the people who we thank are the ones who have made the world better or made someone's world better. And that's a big difference too, because you might not be able to change the world, but you absolutely can change someone's world. And we should be very, very focused on that. Some of us have the potential to change our slice of the world. All of us have the potential to find someone whose heart is where our heart was and to join them in the adventure of moving through life and making a difference in the world. And if you're not going to do this, let me tell you what you are going to do instead. You're going to sit around, you're going to watch TV. Especially this election season when we're naming all the things that are wrong with the world. You're going to sit around, you're going to watch all that, and you're going to blame everybody else. Blame, 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 blame. But here's the deal, and I think you know this. People who blame things don't change things. You're going to look at something that's going to break your heart or grip your heart, and your defense mechanism is going to be somebody needs to do something about that, right? And it's the president's fault, and it's Congress's fault, and it's the government's fault, and it's the school system's fault, and it's the police department's fault, and it's the tax commissioner's fault, and it's the church's fault, and it's the preacher's fault, right? All these, it's everybody's fault. And we're going to do the thing where we watch the TV or whatever, we see what's all wrong with the world, and we mute it. I don't know if you pulled this one. You mute it, then you explain to your family. Let me tell you what's actually going on here, right? Because they're all idiots, right? And I'm going to tell you, I got all the answers, but I can't do anything, right? I got a lot going on. So listen, I got it going on so I can explain it to you. I guarantee you're going to spend some time and energy blaming someone or something. But what if you took all that time and all that energy and used it for changing something? Because as long as you're blaming, things aren't changing. Blame is not a strategy for changing things. Blame is our excuse for inactivity. It's how we avoid changing things. And this comes up a lot in church circles, right? Hear people say, well, I like this about the church, but I don't like this. And so, I wish you had this going on. And I kind of always want to go, but what if you're the person standing in the way of that changing? Like, what if you're the person who's been put here with that on your heart so that you can bring that here? So before you leave, before you shop around, before you look for something that might satisfy that craving temporarily till you find something else that's missing, right? What if before you go, you took all that energy and you put it into what can I do here because that breaks my heart. So just imagine, what if we took the time as a church and all that energy, instead of blaming, to ask how can we change things? What can we change in that area that breaks my heart? So the question is, what is it, though, that breaks your heart? You should know the answer to that. And I'll tell you why I think that you should know the answer in just a minute. Now, if you're here and you're not a Christian, right, so far so good, because you're like, I agree with everything that guy just said, right? And some of the best changes in the world, some of the biggest things that have been done in the world have been done not by spiritual people or Christian people. They're just people who got something on their mind and something in their heart, and they went, someone should do something about that. And they didn't need a Bible verse to do it. They just went and did it, right? And phenomenal things have happened as a result. So if you're not a Christian, you can get on board with this. But if you're a Christian, and let me be more specific because that can mean a lot of things. If you're a Jesus follower, if you're someone who to the best of your ability tries to fashion your life around the teachings of Jesus and the model of Jesus, and none of us get this perfect, but we're all trying, right? Then you must be actively involved at some level in your life, if you consider yourself a Jesus follower, bringing about change. Because people who actively follow Jesus make things better. They just do. You can't actively follow Jesus and not make somebody's life better. You can't actively follow Jesus and not make the place where you live or the place where you work or the people you do life with better. It's impossible because of what Jesus modeled for us. And one of the things we talk about a lot here is that Jesus taught that God measures devotion in terms of your devotion to others. That devotion to God is measured in terms of your devotion to others. That people have a unique value to God. And Jesus completely broke the temple system that he walked in on when he came here. You remember that old school thinking before Jesus was that back from Athens to the Greeks to the Egyptians to the pagan religions before them, that if you wanted God's attention, that you had to try to do something to get God's attention, or if you had some kind of title or status, it was because God blessed you, and so there was a pecking order. And Jesus modeled a new way, that if you want God's attention, then you need to pay attention to the way you treat people around you. Because every person, Jesus taught, every person you're ever eyeball to eyeball with is made in the image of God. Made in the image of God. And people matter to God, and so people should matter to you. And you can't go to a temple, Jesus taught, and go through some routine. And you can't go to church and go through some routine and somehow win the favor of God, because God is very interested in how you treat other people. Devotion to God is measured in terms of your devotion to others. And love for God is measured in terms of your love for others. And so consequently, you follow Jesus through the Gospels. Everywhere he went, people were better off. And he didn't just feel compassion for people. He acted compassionately. He brought heaven here. That's why I think it's so important that when he started his earthly ministry, he announced the kingdom of heaven has arrived. The kingdom of God has arrived. This is a core teaching of the vineyard, that heaven isn't just somewhere you go later. It's something that's brought here. We bring a piece of heaven here. Every time you act compassionately, every time you make someone feel noticed, every time you do something good for someone else, right? Every time you stop and see and apply value to somebody made in the image of God, you're bringing a piece of heaven here, inaugurated by Jesus, purchased with his blood, empowered through that Spirit that raised him back to life, and that life now given to you to bring that good news here, that proclamation of the kingdom here. That's what Jesus did. He totally reversed the world into which he walked. He modeled for his followers, armed with his Spirit inside of them, that people have inherent, not ascribed value. People have inherent, not ascribed value. This is huge. In other words, he modeled there's no pecking order, right? There's not, well, I'm Roman and you're not Roman, sorry. Or, hey, I'm a slave owner and you're a slave, so sorry. Or, I'm a man and you're a woman. Jesus taught it's not the color of your skin or how much money that you have. In the religious system he showed up in, if you had a lot of money, the assumption is that God somehow chose you. Right? He specifically gave you greater value than people who had less than you. And Jesus came along, and the way he conducted ministry, it communicated without any question that everybody is valuable to God. This is an enormous shift in the thinking in the first century, that men, children, and women are all ascribed worth. They were not ascribed worth. They have inherent value just by nature of being human. And Jesus walks along, and all throughout the Gospels, he's just finding people who culture had written off as not having worth. And he looked them eyeball to eyeball and said, you have worth because you were made in the image of God. And so consequently, all down through history, Generations of Christians throughout the generations, men and women who follow Jesus, have built hospitals, not for Christian sick people, but for sick people, for people. They've built orphanages, not for Christian children, but for children. They've built shelters, not for homeless Christians, but for people who are homeless. We do missions, we do medical missions, not for people who say, well, I'm Christian, but for people who are sick, because all people were made in the image of God and have value. And that's what Jesus taught. Right now, we have a partnership with a ministry in Rwanda called Africa New Life. And you'll hear more about this in coming weeks. We'll describe it to you. You'll hear the story how in the aftermath of civil war in 1994, 1.1 million people were murdered in one of the smallest countries in the world. 1.1 million people murdered. And a man named Charles stepped onto the blood-soaked soil of that country and looked around at these children whose parents had all just murdered each other and said, who's going to raise these kids? Who's going to do something about this? It broke his heart. He couldn't stop thinking about it. So he got a Polaroid camera, and he took about a dozen pictures because he had a trip coming up to the United States, and he flew here and thought, if I could get these kids sponsored, it might change their futures. And 25 years later, there's a ministry now called Africa New Life with schools and sponsorship offices all over the country, a hospital, a seminary, because a Jesus follower showed up and asked, not, are these children Christian? But he showed up and he said, they are precious in the eyes of God because they're human. Because his Savior walked into a world with a pecking order, and he reversed that pecking order, and he looked at children and said, suffer these little children to come unto me. And Christians have been doing that ever since. Jesus taught we don't assign value to people for any reason. People are inherently valuable. So consequently, when it comes to what breaks your heart, our hearts can be broken by human need regardless of where those people live. This is so different. I don't know. It's so easy to forget how different this is. It's so easy for us to misunderstand the impact that Jesus had, especially because we're Americans. Our country was birthed with this idea that people have certain unalienable rights, right? But this was so different. In fact, I don't know if you know this story or not, but when Thomas Jefferson sat down to write the Declaration of Independence, they really sweated over every word that they chose. And he submitted a first draft of this document. And when he submitted this first draft, and you're going to recognize this in a second, this is the way he wrote it. We hold these truths to be sacred and undeniable. The word sacred means set apart, holy, right, and undeniable. We hold these truths to be sacred and undeniable. And you know what comes next, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. This was an idea that was foreign to the world that Jesus stepped into, but had been so transformed that Jefferson sat down and he wrote sacred and undeniable. And Ben Franklin, saw that phrase and he goes, you know what? I think we could shorten it. He said, we hold these truths. Let's try self-evident, because it's just obvious, isn't it? It's just obvious. Like if you think about it long enough, you should kind of look around and go, well, yeah, doesn't everyone understand this? That's how much this had changed from the time of Jesus to the time of Jefferson and Franklin, where they just look and they go, that everybody should know that, right? This was not the situation. This was not the situation when Jesus arrived on the scene. But he so changed this view with how he lived that his followers came to understand that when something breaks our hearts because of the needs of humanity, it should break our hearts because people are made in the image of God, and what we do with our lives matters. And what breaks your heart might also break his. Maybe he put it in your heart to break your heart so that you would do something about it because it breaks his. And it's been put there by divine design. Because that's the other thing about Nehemiah's story. Nehemiah's broken heart was by divine design. One of the things that ancient people believed, one of the things that we now believe is that time is linear, that it's all moving in a direction. Something's happening. This is all going somewhere. Time is moving in a way, and God is working in history towards his specific goals with his specific ends. What Nehemiah didn't know is that when God stirred his heart to go back to Jerusalem and rebuild the wall, it was part of a sequence of events that had started long before him and would go on long after him. He was playing a critical role. He had no idea what hung in the balance of his decision to give in to his broken hearts. But about 70 years before Nehemiah, just a little bit more history, about 70 years before Nehemiah, God stirred the heart of a man with a fascinating name named Zerubbabel. And God stirred Zerubbabel's heart to say, go back and start rebuilding the temple. We need to get the temple rebuilt, right? And about 14 years before that, before Nehemiah's heart was stirred, God stirred the heart of another man named Ezra. And he said, go back and teach the people the law. We got to get the temple operating. We got to get the law operating. And then he stirred Nehemiah's heart to say, Nehemiah, go back and get things organized. Reestablish my city. Rebuild the wall. Bring order to things. Now imagine that these men had no idea that all of that was in preparation for an event that would happen 444 years later. That they were working with each other's broken hearts that were put there by divine design to get ready for something that would happen 444 years later, when the final Jewish prophet and priest and king that we know as Jesus would walk into that very city, would walk into that very temple and declare who he was to the Jewish people. They had no idea. Nehemiah had no idea his broken heart was a setup for God to send his son in the world, to do something for us that we couldn't do ourselves. And what's more, God did this because our sin broke his heart. Nehemiah had no idea that his decision to embrace his broken heart was part of what God was up to the whole time. He had absolutely no idea. And maybe that's something that we all need to hear, because I don't think any of us do. You have no idea. You have no idea what hangs in the balance of your decision to embrace the burden God's put on your heart. You have no idea. You have no idea what. You have no idea who. You have no idea what segment of our population. No idea the people in your community or city or nation. No idea what hangs in the balance of your decision to create some space to feel what it is God wants you to feel and to do what it is that God wants you to do. You have no idea what hangs in the balance of your decision to embrace the burden God's placed on your heart. I think some of us need to lose weight. We should lose weight. Some of us need to get out of debt. We should get out of debt. But there is more to you than a body and a balance sheet. And at the end of the day, those things are far too small of things to live for. So what breaks your heart? What breaks your heart? And no, this doesn't mean you need to become an activist. No, I'm not suggesting you quit your job and abandon, do something reckless, right? I'm not advocating you do anything irresponsible. It's just a question. What breaks your heart? What is it that breaks your heart? Is there someone or something that you could attach yourself to? Is there an organization or a ministry you could get involved with? Is there somebody that you could be associated with? Is there something that you could do to become an outlet for you to give that extra time, that extra energy and margin to something that stirred your heart and may have stirred your heart for a long, long time? Because that's how great things happen. And that's something to live for. Not a bad body, not a balance sheet. And I'm just asking you to sit on it. Think about it. And for some of you, we want to help you identify that. If you already know. That's where this idea for Welcome to Midtown came from. This lunch that we'll do after this service. I know it's short notice, but if you don't have lunch plans, we'd love for you to stick around. If not, you can pull out your phone, take a picture of that QR code, sign up for the next one in October. We'll do about once a month. But our goal is to just come together in a room for an informal lunch, to get to know one another, to hear about some of the ministries of the church. And then we want to hear from you, like, what is it? What burden has God placed on your heart? Is there somewhere you could attach yourself here? Are you in tribe? Are you in relationship? How do we discover together how to rebuild this wall and find what it is that we're called to do? In a few weeks, you'll hear something announced called New Life Sunday. And some of you guys know what this is. But again, what we mentioned a minute ago is that we have a partnership with the ministry in Rwanda, where a few years ago they were looking to start a 9th campus in a 9th village all throughout the country, in a place where the poorest of the poor in Rwanda, which is a significantly poor nation, the poorest of the poor live in Namagabi. And we partnered with African New Life to be that sponsoring church. And so we have a village in Rwanda called Namagabi. And about once a year, we kind of stop what we're doing to update you on what's going on in Namagabi and to talk about the ministries there and to make available to you children who are still in need in our village of sponsorship. And this is coming up. But you want to know something that stirred my heart a few years ago, and some of us, we were over there. And I remember Christy and I were on this trip together. And while we were there, we got to see in the capital city of Rwanda, Kigali, we got to see a cohort that trained women to get them out of poverty and systems of poverty, to teach them a skill that they could then lead their family with, because there's a lot of abandoned women in Rwanda. And we saw that, and we made our way to Namagabi, where our village is. And it was incredible to see the amount of ladies that would line up to drop off their kids at this ministry center. Hundreds of women that lined up like we were the Beatles to just catch sight of what we were doing with their kids. It's amazing. And we remembered that women's ministry back in Kigali, and we said, can we bring that here and do that with these ladies here? And they said, well, not yet. We're just not there yet. We don't have the resources to do it, but we're trying to save up. And boy, we were really inspired by that and thought, man, maybe one day. And some of you guys know some of my story. Something that breaks my heart is protecting the vulnerable, specifically women and children, because I was a child who wanted to protect his mama. And so anytime I see opportunities that have to do with protecting the vulnerable, specifically women and children, it breaks my heart. And I want to do something. And a few weeks ago, Christy and I got an email that they had mastered that program in Kigali and were now ready to bring it to a second location, and that they had chosen Namagabi, our village. And they said, we've got to save up a certain amount of money first. And so we went, we'll pay it. It's already, like we sent it, we'll let people fill up the bucket after we empty it, like if you want to, but we're going to go ahead and just put us down for that, right? So you're going to hear more about that in a few weeks. But I did get an email yesterday, and this is incredible. I got an email yesterday about some women who have been affected by this women's cohort ministry there in Rwanda. They started it in Namagabi, which is our village. It's about a 30-day program that teaches women how to do all sorts of things, but it's also an opportunity for discipleship and just basic education, right? And I want to introduce you, well, based on our pledge, let me just go ahead and show you this. Based on our pledge, we got an email yesterday that 19 women have given their lives to Christ through this program. Those are the 19 ladies right there. And the next one is a picture of a young lady named Elina. And Elina's story, she's the eldest of 9 children. She grew up in a family that struggled daily to make ends meet. And her life took a difficult turn when she became pregnant at a young age, and she feared how her father would react. After revealing her pregnancy, she was met with disappointment and anger. She made the difficult decision to leave home. For a time, her child's father offered support, but then he disappeared. And she was left alone to face the uncertainties of single motherhood. With no income and nowhere to turn, she found herself in a seemingly hopeless situation, yet she remained determined to build a better future for her unborn child. She gave birth to her son and returned home to an empty house with no means of provision, and soon after returning from the hospital, she was evicted. She considered giving her son up for adoption, and around this time, African New Life's Women's Development Program selected her to participate in their sewing program. And she's learned valuable skills, including financial management, reproductive health. She's gained the means to support herself and her son. And now she dreams of owning her own sewing shop, and she's on the cusp of doing so. She's in a relationship with Jesus today that gives her hope, peace, community, faith, and possibility. All because 25 years ago, a guy walked onto the blood-soaked soil of Rwanda and saw all these parents that were dead and all these orphans that needed raising and said somebody should do something about this. And it broke his heart. And he had no idea what hung in the balance. Elena's picture wouldn't be up there had he not leaned into that broken heart. So the question, God, what breaks my heart? Gosh, there's a lot that hangs in the balance potentially, isn't there? It's an important one. God, what breaks my heart? And God, what can I do about what breaks my heart? And then, God, what can I do with just who I am? That's why I love the way this first chapter ends. Did you catch it? He tells that whole story about what broke his heart, and then he ends the chapter with that mic drop line, I was cupbearer to the king. Like, who was I? This was the opportunity I had. This was the stewardship of influence I had. This is who I was. And so consequently, I took who I was and I did with who I was and what I had, what I could, to address the thing that broke my heart. I was cupbearer to the king. That's what I had. That's what I had. So God, what can you do with this? Your own improvement is far too small a thing to live for. I think some of us should lose weight. I think some of us should get out of debt. But at the end of the day, you are more than a body and a balance sheet. And there is a world out there that needs fixing, that breaks God's heart, and he's empowered you to do it. So what breaks your heart? What can you do with what you have? Lord Jesus. This text is so inspiring. When we think about Nehemiah and his embracing of what broke his heart, you put that heartbreak there. And it was in preparation for your arrival in this world, Jesus. He had no idea. We look at Nehemiah's story and think somehow Nehemiah is exceptional, but the truth of Scripture is that if we've said yes to you, you've given us a new heart. And your Holy Spirit empowers us. It means we're a room full of Nehemiahs. People who can do something with what they have and not hide behind blame and inactivity. So Jesus, as we lean in right now, would you whisper to us? Would you help us put our finger on it? And then what we can do. And how this church, how we can come together and help inspire each other towards that action as we rebuild together. We want to come around the same stuff. This time, Pastor Jane's going to come up and help walk us through some questions as we examine this together and before we close. If it's your first time with us, I look forward to meeting you in the lobby. Jesus, continue to work in this room. Continue to inspire.
Thank you again for joining us online. We hope you enjoyed the message. To connect with us, you can follow us on Instagram or Facebook. For more information on who we are, check out our website, midtownvineyardchurch.com. We'd love to hear from you. Make sure you leave us a review or drop us a comment. Until next time, have a great day.